So hello and good evening. My name is Cheryl Ziegler. I'm the director of the Union League Club Library and Archives. And on behalf of the ULCC Library Committee and Literary Subcommittee, welcome to our Cocktails and Conversations with Chicago Authors series. Tonight, we're delighted to bring you a sports edition featuring three incredibly talented writers. Jonathan Eig is a former staff writer. Jonathan, you wanna wave? Jonathan Eig is a former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and has written award-winning biographies on the world's best athletes, including Lou Gehrig, Jackie Robinson, and in his latest book, Muhammad Ali. You will often see Jonathan around the club, and we're so proud to have him as a Union League Club Distinguished Writer Privilege holder. Melissa Isaacson is an award-winning sports writer and has long been a fixture in Chicago sports media. She currently is teaching at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism and is the author of State, A Team, a Transformation. And it's the story of her Niles West High School's 1979 girls basketball state championship. Robert Scoop Jackson is a national senior writer for ESPN and has covered issues of race, culture, politics, and sports for various publications for over 25 years. His latest book, The Game is Not a Game, was just released in March. It's an illuminating and unflinching examination of the good and evil inherent in the sports industry. So before I turn this over to our panelists, you should know that they'll be welcoming questions which can be submitted by typing into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So whenever you feel the need to ask a question, please put it in there. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible during and after the discussion. And so, with my thanks for all of your time and talent, I now turn this over to Jonathan, Scoop, and Melissa. Melissa, you want to start?
Yeah, so I won, so I get to go first. I was just bossy. And so thank you so much for having me. You know, I know this isn't exactly cheers to all. I know this isn't exactly, we'll try not to drink too much during the session, what we had in mind, but you know, it's still very nice to be together and I'm thrilled to be here. I've been teaching all day. I getting very used to Zoom. We were saying, you know, it's still like to talk on the phone once in a while, but it's very nice to see everybody's faces, and it's actually worked out really well. I feel like we could talk about it at some point, but I feel like I've become a better teacher in many ways because of it, doing it remotely. I know that's not the way we wanted it to be, but I really have had to like dig down. So, but just to tell you a little bit about my book, it's intensely personal. You know, we were all raised to be, in our generation of journalists, not to write about ourselves. At least that's what I was taught. And so it was one of the first times where I ever did. And it was really uncomfortable at first, writing a Tribune magazine story, which is one of the iterations of the book. But basically what it is a story of my 1979 high school basketball team, Niles West High School. We won the state championship. I'm not gonna, I didn't ruin it for you because you see it on the cover. And we beat Jackie Joyner's team, which most of you are probably old enough to know who Jackie Joyner is. I hope so anyways. And that's where, you know, the basketball part of it sort of ends. It's really more of a coming of age story of this first generation of Title IX girls. It's from our voices, from my voice as a teenager. And it really kind of explores the incredibly transformative experience that we had, you know, when boys were, when that generation of boys were growing up, it was just automatic. It was inherent that they would get life lessons through sports. They were put into Little League when they were, you know, 5, 6 years old, and learned all the life lessons that would serve them so well later, both in life and in business and in other careers. Things like, you know, sacrificing for the good of the team, and negotiating and being a leader and being a follower and strategizing and setting goals and all those things that you don't really realize when you're a little kid that you get, that girls just really didn't. We didn't get that until I think the mid to late 70s. And it's not to say that girls, weren't successful before that and didn't become very successful women. But my favorite part of my book is the epilogue, because it talks about what happened to us and how it was directly related to the experience that we had in high school. And so, it wasn't until then that we discovered the whole world kind of opened up to us through this experience. So it was, although intensely personal, it was a great joy to tell this story. Ultimately, it took 15 years from first column in the Tribune to getting published. And it was painful at times trying to get it published and trying to work it out. It started as a young adult book. It became, it was kind of a basketball book. And then it really became, like I said, more of a coming of age story involving the story of my parents and them going through their struggle with Alzheimer's, which really began when I was in high school and involved my teammates' families and everything that was swirling around us in the 70s. So I think that these guys, a lot of the stuff that they wrote about, probably we had something in common with it being a societal book, as well as, book about the central characters. I don't want to speak for them, but I'll pass the baton. I hope I didn't go on too long. But thank you again. It'll be so fun. Anytime I'm with these guys, it's wonderful and an honor.
Hey, Melissa, before we go to the next one, can I ask you a question? When did you realize that it was going to transform from a story to a book? When did that hit you that you wanted to expand, what the central nucleus of that story was? When did that hit?
So the column was in the Tribune on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of our state championship. And I wrote it as all the things that I found out we never knew when we were kids. That my coach was a young woman that we didn't know at the time, knew nothing about basketball. And she huddled in the corner of the teacher's lounge with the legendary boys coach at our school at the time, who scribbled X's and O's on napkins and taught her how to teach us. We didn't know that our principal, who was just the mean 70s principal, was absolutely instrumental in getting girls varsity sports and state championships. We didn't know all the things that were going on in our homes, because in the 70s, you guys will remember, your parents would be like, so-and-so's getting divorced. It was like a whisper. You weren't supposed to know. And it was, pre-social media, obviously. So that was what the column was. And I could talk about that more later, but one of my high school classmates, who was one of the editors of the school paper, became a Hollywood producer. He did a lot of young adult books and turned them into screenplays like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants and Pretty Little Liars and different things. And so he saw it on the internet, this column, and called me and said, I'd like to make this into a screenplay. It was a kind of a book packaging company is what they called it.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so he took it and what was it called? I'll think of it in a second. But he took it and he'd say things to me over the course of me writing it over the next few months, and he'd say like, in this scene, I want you to do this. In this scene, I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know what scenes meant. Right. I didn't know what young adult meant. So right. That's what's triggered it, and then it just sat around like these projects often do. I sort of became depressed and sick of it and didn't. So I picked it up sporadically over the next 15 years. But that's he gave me a few $1,000 to write a book. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have to tell you this, and I'm gonna let Jonathan speak. I have to tell you this. You undersold that book. When you told me about it before it was released, you told me about it. You undersold that book. It's amazing. Like you really kept it low. You're like, hey, I got a book coming out. It's about this. I'm like, okay, listen. You really undersold it because it's much larger in scope than the way you presented it.
I think I've gotten better at describing it, if nothing else.
It's really cinematic, and it's interesting to hear you say that you were thinking about scenes when you wrote it, because that's something that it's taken me a long time to learn. I'm still working on it, trying to create scenes that you can see. Obviously, when you're reading, it's hard. You're asking the reader to close their eyes and imagine. But thinking about these scenes like movies with characters that you develop with with characters who are fighting to get like more lines written for them, right? All of that really makes you a better writer. And if you had somebody telling you, hey, we're going to turn this book into a movie when you're done, I think that could really help your mentality. It sounds like it did for you, right?
Well, but I still didn't get it. And as a journalist, we're very like, oh boy, you better not change one word in a quote. And they were saying in later years, the editor that I had recently was like, you need to create, have some dialogue in this scene. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to recreate dialogue. Are you kidding? And I tried to get it as close as humanly possible. And it still really bothered me that it wasn't word for word as it was 40 years ago. And she kind of talked me into, that's narrative nonfiction. You can do that. And I was confident that I was recreating it as close as possible. But, I read things like that. Pat Conroy's book, that championship season? Was that which one? I'm thinking of military in the Citadel. He had this terrible losing season. And I remember reading this from the 60s thinking like, come on, how does he remember that he scratched his eye, or whatever? And I realized that's what narrative nonfiction is. You could do it responsibly and you could do it well. And that was hard though, as a reporter,
Yeah, I think with memoir too, you get with memoir too, you get a little bit more flexibility because it's about your memory. So you're not quoting, you weren't there, you weren't, using a tape recorder. Most people weren't keeping diaries that detailed. But if it's a memoir and it's about your own life, you got a lot more freedom.
Yeah, thank God there was people who had better memories than me who filled in gaps, and I had a lot of people to fill in gaps. So yeah.
You all are better than me because my whole approach to those things have been as being like a writer and trying to stay true to the craft of just writing for what we're writing. It's like, that's what script writers are for. My job is not to write your script. My job is to write this book. Now, if you want to option this, you can option it, but I'm not supposed to envision like scenes when I'm writing. I'm telling a story. So let me tell the story and you do what the hell you want to with it once you get it. So you all are better at adapting than I have been because I've been horrible. I'm like, no, I'm not doing all that. I can't think that way as a writer. I can't visually think in scripts because I'm not a script writer. I'm not a screenwriter. I don't do that. So you all are good.
Well, I've always taken the same approach as you, Scoop. Like, I'm going to write the book. If you want it, take it, do whatever you want with it. Make up scenes, make up dialogue. I don't care. But then on my Muhammad Ali book, they optioned it for a TV series, Morgan Freeman's production company, and they asked me to come and sit in the writer's room to help develop the first couple of scripts. And suddenly I'm making up dialogue, I'm saying, why don't we just give him an affair right here in this scene? Why don't we let him have an affair? Why don't we let his dad, have another drink, and suddenly I'm making stuff up and it's very dangerous. It's really fun. But then I got to go back to book writing world and like you, I'm, just the facts, man.
Just the facts. It's a totally different, and it's hard to transition from one to the other, especially on the fly. I think over years, I think people are doing it now because the genre has lent itself to writers like crossing those boards and coming back and doing this, that, and the other. It's almost like they're multitasking. We kind of came up in the back end of a generation where this is it. You kind of like Melissa said, I'm a reporter. This is what I do. I'm conditioned to do this. For me to think this way and process at the same time, it's kind of tough. So, but now it's a little bit different. So, but it's a whole different form of writing. So it's hard to get to, from my understanding, on the fly.
It is.
I had no idea what narrative nonfiction was. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say that the nature of the book business now is it's getting tougher to get a book deal. It's getting tougher to sell books. People aren't reading as much. So the agents want to know, is there movie potential here? So they're pushing you to think about converting your book before you've even written it. And I think some books are that's dangerous for some books because then you're tempted to cut corners. You're tempted to create stuff that's more cinematic, make happy endings, create bad guys. You got to be really careful once you start that kind of a cycle, I think.
I honestly, I know it's going to sound phony, but I never thought that it would be, nor is it yet, a movie or TV project. I've got people talking about it, but when I started, they just said, write a manuscript. And that's what I did. Because I didn't know how to write for TV or movies. So I thought, well, that'd be cool if they want to do that someday. And then when that died, I lost all hope or all thought that it would ever be like that. So even as I was constructing narrative nonfiction dialogue, I still didn't envision it. I think that's dangerous. I agree. I think it's really dangerous to start becoming something you're not, you know, as a script writer or whatever. I don't screenplay writer. I always thought I'd love to try that, but it might be too late for that in my life. I don't know. But even if it's not too late, I mean, I'd love to try it, but I have no skills for that right now. So I just wrote it as I wrote it. I learned how to do sort of narrative nonfiction. I didn't know that either, how you have to keep, you know, you can't go back, you know, in time. You sort of have to support it and keep the string going of each character and close it. And I still don't really know clearly what I'm doing, but I got a lot of coaching on that. Was a completely different writing than I had ever attempted.
Exactly.
But it was fun. But how did you guys, you know, so I've written 3 books in my life, and there's like, I don't know, a dozen years between them or something. The
Right.
Lupinella book was written during the 15-year period in which I first wrote the first version of the manuscript for State and finished it. I wrote a quick turn Lupinella book and another quick turn transition game about the Bulls years ago. Right now, I'm still sort of exhausted by the thought, even though I've got a lot of ideas for a new book. You guys have written several books. And do you like right away start working on your next one? How does that work? I don't know how you do it. I think John does.
Jonathan, you asked, could I let Jonathan, because he's really the book expert of this whole group, because that's what he's been able to do, and it's been amazing watching him do that. But my situation is more like you. My book projects have been so unique and so particular and so spread out that I'm more in your lane. Jonathan, I think you should go and give us the global answer to this question.
All right, well, I'll just tell you my journey. You know, I worked as a newspaper magazine reporter for a long time, and I always thought about writing a book, but never thought I knew how to do it, and felt like I was incapable of doing it, wasn't even ready to try. And then when I was about 30, I guess, about 32, 33, I read Seabiscuit when it first came out.
Laura Hillebrand.
Woo!
One of the greatest. Go ahead. I'm sorry. That man.
That book just blew my mind because suddenly, like every other sports book, fell apart. Like they were all doing it wrong, and Laura Hillenbrand was doing it right. Like and I was having, I'll never forget, I was having this conversation with my wife over dinner saying, I'm trying to figure out why this book is so much better than any sports book I've ever read. And I started deconstructing it, as we all do, right? When you're a writer and you're jealous of someone else's work, you deconstruct it. You figure out, how did she do that? Maybe I can steal something. Maybe I can learn something. And I thought, first of all, she chose a subject that was way bigger than sports. Second of all, she had all this coverage from the horse races, 20 reporters covering every race. You can go back and cherry pick all the best writing for the key details. She had great characters, and she had the Great Depression, so you have this terrific setting. I just need to find a book like that. and I said, what you need is because baseball's perfect, because baseball's 154 games a year in the old days, right? With at least 5 or 6 reporters at every game. If it's New York, a New York team, you probably have 10 or 20 reporters at every game. So let's find a story that's about more than baseball. Like Lou Gehrig. I just said it off the top of my head. Like Lou Gehrig, that's an American tragedy. That's Shakespearean stuff right there. The strongest man in baseball finds out he's dying and keeps playing because he doesn't know what's wrong with him. And it makes him stronger than ever. This disease is where he finds his true strength. I was like, holy shit, I gotta write that book. Oh my God. And I ran to my computer to check to see whether there was a Lou Gehrig biography out there. And that's how I started writing books, because I just had an idea. And I right then and there, I think about this all the time. When I talk to students, I always say, number one thing you need to do is give yourself permission, because I was not a sports writer. I was not an expert on Lou Gehrig. I was not an expert on ALS. I was not an expert on anything. I was just a guy with a notebook and a pen. And I could have right there and then said, now I'm sure somebody else is already working on it, or somebody else could do it better than me. But I just said, what the hell? I'm going to try it. I'm going to try it and see if anybody shuts me down. And nobody shut me down. And now I'm on, book number 6, and I'm doing the same thing. And I'm waiting for somebody to shut me down because I feel like a fake, because I don't have a key to the club. I don't have golden ticket. I just decided I'm going to try it and see if I can get away with it. And I
fake,
was lucky.
fake it till you make it, and when you make it, keep faking it. That's it.
That's it.
I feel
That's
guilty
exactly
because
right.
you guys, like Jonathan hunting down Muhammad Ali, and I mean, it's so interesting, the side story to your, the story of your story, how you did the reporting and how you found people and just go door to door and all that cool stuff. I mean, I had all my teammates sitting there basically. And Scoop, I mean, how did you find the reporting for yours, Scoop? Was it arduous for you?
Yeah, my situation is, like I said, is a little bit different because it was just me trying to transform what I was doing for ESPN for 11 years as a columnist, and then flushing what could have been contemporary contemporary columns into chapters. And that just takes more research. And, my arrogance is of the belief that, I can out-research anybody by myself. And that's a skill set I got when I was in grad school. I mean, I came from undergrad, but really in grad school, I think I perfected it. And, when I got my master's degree and all this, that, and the other, and the research it took to do that, because I was one of, if not the first person in the country to ever do an academic study on hip hop. And I presented it to a board that thought hip hop was just noise and it was anti-hip hop. So the research I had to do to dive in to even prove that that form of music was an art form was, work within itself. So coming out of that and being able to do this, I just felt I had my arrogance was like, I can out-research anybody by myself. So getting to your question about the book, that's what it was. It was like, okay, let's pick chapters and contemporary topics that are being discussed in American sports right now over the last couple of years, and let's do a deep dive. And I had not really done a deep dive. And, because, you write a column, so it's 1,500 words, 800 words, at most 2,500, depending on the length of the column. That's not deep research necessary. But when you're doing chapters, and you're doing books and, lawsuits can come from that and all this and the other, your dive gets a little bit deeper. So in doing that deep dive, I just picked subjects and said, what can I do a deep dive on? And just individually went into each chapter doing a deep dive. And doing what I really love, which is research, and coming out with unique information, not just surface it, but unique information to try to support whatever narrative I was trying to write for that chapter. So, and what's funny is that we're sitting there talking about sports, and we've all done this for a long time, but this is actually my first sports book.
Oh.
Yeah, it's my 5th book, but my first sports book. Because I don't include the Nike book we did as a sports book. That's a gym shoe book. That's not, really sports, related, but it's my first real dive into sports. So it was, and in my mind, I've been in this game for over 25 years. So if I'm going to put, my name on a book after covering sports for 25 years, it has to be official, so my dives went like, I wanted to make sure that I exhausted all the information I thought was important to each chapter. And there was no research assistance. There was no help. It was just me owning whatever I feel my skill set is, and coming out and, not just the writing, but the information and using that to force whatever I was going to write. I was writing around the research that I had come up with. So that's kind of how my project, that's how the book, kind of evolved into what it became, and what's on the shelves right now.
I'd love to hear you guys talk about that last point you made, Scoop, that, we're doing this alone. I'm assuming, Missy, you don't have a team of researchers behind you. I don't either. My office here is my filing system, and it's for one guy, one woman to write a book with, hundreds of sources and thousands of pages of source material and, years and years of newspapers to go through and searching for original material, trying to bring something new to the subject. It's a stupid job, really, right? It makes no sense for one person to try to gather that much information and make sense of it. I wonder if you guys have learned any tricks over the years to processing this this ridiculous amount of information and then figuring out how to make a story out of it?
Well, that's funny you should say, because I'm still trying to figure it out. And there's many times that I wish that I would have taken a magazine course from you or, any number of people at Northwestern, Alex Kotlowitz, or, Patty Walter. I'm trying to figure out the way to do it because I never really knew the way to do it. Yesterday in my class, my undergrad intro to sports writing class, which I also invited my graduate students to, I had the director of the Last Dance, Jason Hare, and his coordinating producer, Jake Rogel. And, my kids, my students, understandably, they're students. So they find it difficult. I'm having them write between 800 and 1,000 word enterprise story. Many of them are COVID related, things like how did seniors react to having their season taken away, their last season ever? How about Olympians with a small window and now they've got to wait a year? All kinds of different cool stories like that what's happening COVID related and other things. And they're having trouble boiling it down to 1,000 words from, 10 sources or more. I'm always pushing them more and more and more. So here's now the two guys who put together The Last Dance that had 10,000 hours of footage, 108 interviews. And so I thought it would be real, even though it's not a documentary class, it'd be really helpful to get their, and they were great. And I'm still not sure, it's not easy. It's the hardest thing in the world, it's a whittled down, and that's what journalism is. That's the great skill that I always tell my students. If you can do this, even if you're not going to be a journalist one day, if you can take great amounts of information and whittle it down to a really informative, entertaining, cohesive, concise piece of work that will entertain and inform and tell me something I don't know and make me want to read it. That's a great skill in anything. So, but it's very difficult to teach. It's very difficult for me to learn. It's just every time it's difficult. And we all know that feeling when you're finished with any piece of work. You're like, I don't know a single good writer out there who doesn't finish whatever they do and go, oh, it's awful. Like, I wish I would have done this, or like, I left this out. I mean, you should feel like you're leaving out great stuff. Even John, I bet, even with your gigantic Ali book, I bet you felt like you left out great stuff. That's what you should feel.
Oh, hell yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
but that's, right? But that's what it is. It's like, that's what I try to tell them. The more people you interview, the more you're increasing your odds of having great stuff.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and all stuff is not great stuff. That's one thing that's the trick you have to understand. Just because you have the information doesn't make it good information. You have to piece the information together and get not just the best of it, but what best supports what you already have. So you may have a quote or that works as a great standalone, but a more subtler quote from that interview supports what you have in there before and makes that point stronger, and then makes your story stronger as you go along. The trick is how to use that and be able to push the other quote that you had in your mind to the side to build the story better as opposed to what you have in your mind. But it's all about the art of storytelling. And what you're trying to teach and what we're trying to teach and what we're trying to do, even in the process, in the middle of our careers, is still perfect the art of storytelling at the end of the day. And Melissa, you have a challenge on your hand because we're all past this point, but you're living in existence where, and I hate to throw his name out there and blame him for this, but I'm blaming him for it, but I'm giving him credit at the same time. You're living in the era of Bill Simmons, who wrote Stream of Consciousness and Bill Simmons never threw anything away. Whatever comes in his mind, he just puts on the page and it works for him. So for you to teach a class or tell individuals, young individuals, hey, this is the way it's supposed to be done. They're like, wait, I'm reading this dude and his career has gone this way and this many people found this, that, and the other. Why should I listen to you? So you're in a struggle because the exact opposite is what is being embraced right now a lot of times in writing because of what Bill has been able to do with his style of writing. But I'm with you. There's something about the art of taking things out. Jonathan, the long answer for my situation, in your question is I often relate writing to other art forms, specifically music and I want to say film, but film and television. So in music, you hear stories about how like we recorded 70 songs for this album and reduced it to 13. And then you realize, oh shit, this is one of my favorite albums. Like, I want to know what the other songs sound like, but there's a reason they did that, because in their frame, they're giving you what we were and who we were as an artist in this moment, in these 13 songs, as opposed to this 75. So what are the small things about these 75 that didn't make the cut? You know, what is it? Yeah. So from my standpoint as a writer, I know it can be done because I've seen it done in the past. I've just seen it in other art forms. And you see films where, like you said, Melissa, we shot 2,000 hours of films and we reduced it to this, you know, and this, that. So me knowing that it's been done before allows me to always think, okay, I have the ability to do it too.
Yeah,
you know, so I use those mind tricks to get me to reduce like certain things and make sure that I'm giving you the best of what I have and the best that's going to support this and make it the best for you and give this story or this chapter or whatever it is, the best life it can live, as opposed to like just trying to give you everything all at once.
Yeah, you know, Elmore Leonard, I think his number one rule for writing was leave out the boring part. And
exactly.
We all have a habit, it's really hard to fight, to want to put in your quotes to show off that you got an interview with this important person, right? So you got to put in the quote just to show that you got an interview with that important person. And it's hard. It takes discipline. You got to remind yourself, the reader wants to hear a story. They don't care how many people you interviewed. They'll feel it if you've got the goods. If you know this subject inside and out, they're going to feel it. And they may not say, oh my God, I can't believe he interviewed, you know, Michael Jordan. You're just putting that quote in there to show off because the quote may not be any good. Michael Jordan never gave you any good quotes. So I think that it's something that it's really hard. I tell young writers this all the time, like, don't over rely on the quotes, but it's a huge temptation.
That was one of the struggles I had to deal with early. You know, that's one of the struggles I had to deal with early in my career, is getting great quotes from unknown people. Mm-hmm. And, you know, because to me, it was all about making the story better. So I would get I was one of those guys that went to sporting events and be covering sporting events, but I wouldn't sit in the media box. I'd find somewhere to sit in the stands, because you get personal conversations and you get insight to the game. So you can go after the game, you know, before the game and get your quotes and talk to people that said, but during the game, especially in a situation like if it's the Bulls Knicks, you know, where, you know, the media is doing their job, but the fans are so emotionally engaged in the game. It's always better to sit with the fans and get quotes from them, because you get the real story of what it feels like. So I would do stories and come back with quotes from like random fans. I get their name and everything, but trying to say, hey, we want another quote from Michael Jordan. But like I said, Michael's not giving me nothing, but this fan said something amazing, and trying to sell editors and all this about like, hey, this is better for the story. Yeah. You're looking at one thing, we're looking at another thing, and in our minds, we're trying to give you the best story.
Yeah, I have a question for that. I'm going to ask Missy this question, but it's off of what Scoop said. You know, the first time, I was never a beat reporter, but the first time I had a press pass to cover the Bulls, I couldn't believe it. The reporters weren't even watching the fourth quarter. They were going into the locker room to get a good spot in front of Jordan's locker. And God. They didn't know who won the game or what happened. They were, you know, maybe they'd get it, on TV, but it's the opposite of what Scoop was saying. Not only were they not out there like soaking up the atmosphere.
That was not me.
They weren't even in the press box. They were fighting for a good spot in front of the locker. So what does that herd mentality, that pack journalism, do to the quality of the storytelling, in your opinion, Missy?
Oh, it's awful. I mean, it's kind of what led to like the whole Manti Te'o story. You know, those of you who remember the Manti Te'o story that was made up and built on nothing. And what happened was very good journalists just repeated the story that was told because, well, after all, it was in the New York Times, or it was here, it was there. It's kind of the same mentality that we just follow the pack. If you're ever in a situation at a Super Bowl with 1 million reporters, the good guys are never in the pack. They're very rarely in that mob. I probably was in the mob a lot, but I will say I never saw myself in Last Dance. Like, never saw. I don't know where I was. I have no way of proving I was there, but I was there. But but yeah, I think that you go for the. You can get that stuff. You can get it on quote sheets or whatever. You want the other people. You want the one-on-one. You want the the offbeat stuff. So I don't think I was jockeying for a spot at Michael's locker because I would have wanted to wait everyone out and then try to get Michael. In those days, we had the advantage of time. We had better deadlines. We had, we weren't tweeting, obviously every second and trying to, so we could digest stuff. We could ask good questions. We could think it through. I mean, we could live with the story and die with the story for a day, not getting beat. You had to live with it. There was bad things involved, but there was some really good things. And one of them was you didn't have to be so much the herd because of this panic to tweet it out, I don't want to act like an old crank, but that's kind of how I feel about it.
Jonathan, can I give you my, answer to the question you asked, Missy? Is that, and this is just my belief, is that the people that you saw rushing to the herd and doing this and the other, trying to do this and the other, to me, those will always and have been and continue to be writers that are insecure about their ability to write. The ones that are really good know that they can tell and write a story, whether Michael Jordan's quote in there or whoever's quoted there or not. There's a confidence in what they can do. So to me, I've always believed when you see that and you saw those people doing this, that, and the other, and they need this and they need it, those were the insecure writers. I've always looked at it that way.
That's
and if you knew that you were good and solid about what you can turn out, and hit that midnight or 1 a.m. deadline, and you can give them, 30 inches or whatever, and you were really, really confident in what you did, you didn't worry about getting to that herd. To me, that was always a sense of insecurity in writers because they were always looking for something to cover what they were unable to do.
That's a great point.
Yeah, do you think that attracted you to your subject, Jonathan? Because there's got to be like a real peacefulness in even though maybe you wondered if other people were going to write Ali or whatever else you've done, other projects, being not tied to the competition and just being able, I'm sure you were in a little bit of an urgency to get stuff, but did you feel a certain sort of, I don't know, serenity in writing your books? Yeah.
It's still stressful.
I'll be right back.
It's really stressful. But at the same time, like I know I have 3 years that eventually I'm going to get Don King to talk to me, even if it takes me 3 years. It literally took me 3 years of knocking on his door and calling him and showing up at places where I knew he was going to be, and it worked. But it took me almost 3 years to get him. But to your point, even when I was a magazine writer, I remember one time I went into the locker room to try to interview Derrick Rose during his MVP season, and I knew I didn't have to cover the game. So I could sit back and wait until all the reporters got their questions asked. I didn't want the other reporters to hear my questions.
Right.
I waited till I was done, till they were all done. And Derrick was chill. He didn't have any place to go, and he was just hanging out and talking to some of the guys in the locker room. And I noticed there was one other reporter who was like hanging around like I was, and he was just waiting and waiting. And then he started joking around with Derrick, and it was clear that like he had a good rapport with him. And I couldn't figure out, the guy looked so familiar. And then I saw them like walking off together, like, and the guy got into the car with Rose. I said, who the hell is that? How did you do that? I went back to the next game and I said, you look familiar. Who are you? It was Rick Riley. That son of a bitch. He's so good.
Exactly.
And he was so smart about how he handled it, right? Same as me. Like he wasn't on deadline pressure, but he was just taking the time to establish some rapport, get to know him, gain some trust. And that's, I can do that over 3-4 years with a book. But Riley was brilliant at doing it, like just in a couple of days. He was in town for a couple of days.
And that's why those SI stories were always so fun, to wait until Thursday to get the magazine. And for me, it was always Thursday. I don't know if everybody else. Yeah. And go, how did they do that? And it was frightening as a beat writer because you knew that that they did get that they could wait around, and you know, they were great at that. And
I don't know about you, but
yeah.
those guys were my heroes growing up.
Oh,
Frank
for
Ford,
sure.
oh
Curry Kirkpatrick I liked a lot.
my God,
And Frank, of course. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it makes me want to weep about Sports Illustrated, but no, it's hard as a beat writer to resist that urge
Sorry,
to
I'm back.
be, yeah, to,
Can I
you
throw
know,
a name in there too? Gary Smith was my guy.
oh, he's the best. He's God.
Yeah,
You know why Gary Smith's so great? If you talk to Gary Smith, I'm sure you guys know this. Gary Smith's like ask any sports writer, he's Mount Rushmore. I mean, he's
he's Michael Jordan of sports writing.
he's it. And the reason why, and he's very humble, of course, and he'll tell any student that he considers him much more of a reporter than a brilliant writer. He was both. But he'll say, and that's the greatest lesson for students too, is that it's all, if you're a fabulous reporter, and Mark Vayneru-Wada said to my class today, I take a great reporter any day over the flowery writer. If you if you work your ass off, it's like defense wins championships. Be the great reporter that works. Anybody could be a great reporter. You know,
Right.
not everybody could be a gifted writer. If you're both, you're Gary Smith. But if you work super hard on the reporting, the writing will come a lot easier, and it'll be good. You know,
I met somebody once who was the subject of a Gary Smith profile, and I was so excited because I said, I got to know what it's like to be interviewed by that guy. And he said, it was like going through 10 years of therapy.
I bet.
he was incredible. And I'm sorry, I had to go let my wife in the house. So that's why right.
I'm
You're
told
excused.
we have some
We have
questions.
questions. Yeah, we have questions.
Somebody wanted to know who are the writers now? Where are they working? You know, the outstanding sports writers. You know, we talked about the SI guys who inspired us. You know, where do you read that now? Who's doing the best work out there, and in what forum would you say?
Wow.
Oh boy. Well,
That's a good one.
yeah.
There's not as much good stuff. I would argue that this era, the sports writing is not as strong as it used to be.
You know,
Wright
Wright
Thompson.
Thompson, Wright Thompson.
Right.
He wrote a wonderful Michael Jordan piece, his roots in North Carolina. I don't know if you saw that on ESPN.com yesterday, I believe.
Yeah.
You know, I like some young people like Miran Fader is one that I don't know if anyone knows. She writes for Bleacher Report. I hope she keeps going. She's very good. Right. Yeah, she's very good. I have to stop and think for a little bit, but I mean, there's wonderful still writers who are young, and you know, my age as well. But this, you know, Sports Illustrated is just not what it was. I mean, I love S.L. Price and always will, and he was my inspiration for getting through my story, because every time I'd see him, he's a friend. Scott Price writes for Sports Illustrated, has written brilliant books. Every time I'd see him, he'd go, what's going on with your book? And I would tell him, I would be able to tell him about the book. It would sound great. It would sound much better than what I was doing. And he'd be like, what are you doing? You know, every year I'd see him at the US Open. He'd be like, what's happening with your book? I'm like, embarrassed. And then finally one day he just goes, Missy, it's your story. Just tell it. And like, I don't know why that was an epiphany for me. Like, oh, okay. Well, maybe that's, you know, but he's terrific. He's wonderful. I don't know.
For me, though, it's more about consistency. And I'm not trying to be like sounding like the old man or anything, but I see glimpses of great writers, you know, younger writers, but they're not as consistent as they have to be, where you read a couple of good stories, then they'll fall off and then maybe get back to it, as opposed to like when we pick up, like you mentioned Rick Riley and, you know, we mentioned Laura, it's like Laura Hillebrand. It's like every time you read something with their byline on it, it was going to move you.
Yeah.
And they forced themselves. And I think the editors that they were working with, or the whatever the genre writing was, they had people that were forcing them to reach a certain level. And I don't think that's around now, because a lot of people that are doing the writing don't have people that are forcing them to do it. They're doing it on their own, whether they're doing it through blogs or they're doing it through entities where you don't have true and tried editors in chiefs, or you have outlets that aren't going to lose anything if they don't come up with good content. So I don't have anybody that I'm following on a regular basis I can call out that has, you know, that I'm like, okay, I have to read everything that they're writing, because I haven't found anybody consistent. Like, you know, like, oh, this is cool. And then, damn, next time, you know, I haven't found that every time you pick up something with somebody's name on it that's covering sports, that's younger now. Not of our generation. I'm talking about that's younger now, that's hitting on, you know, that's doing it 82 games. That's doing it for 162. That's doing it all 16. I haven't found it yet.
The writers that are very valued by young people, and they should be, are the ones that are breaking the stories all the time, the Wojs, you know, and the Schefters. And that's not to say they can't tell a good story, but they're known for breaking stories, and they're known
not asked
for,
to.
Right, they're not known.
They're not asked to. They're asked to break. It's two different
There's a
things.
premium,
Exactly.
there's a premium now on speed and on cranking out lots of content and doing videos, and there's a price to be paid for that. And maybe there's not as much value in the long feature stories anymore. That doesn't get as many clicks, and doesn't pay for itself anymore. So, you know, some of it is just about supply and demand, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm still teaching is because I believe in my heart that there's still a place for good storytelling, and I know Jonathan teaches it too, and you know, I mean, if the two could merge, that's the best of all worlds. But you know, The Athletic is doing good things, and their philosophy of kind of not writing the game story and the play-by-play and letting things develop over a few days and writing the more thoughtful pieces. That's, I think, a good way to go, and it's why the really good writers in the country are all going to The Athletic and want to go if they're not there already. So, you know, so that was encouraging to see. And I mean, we all pray The Athletic keeps going. That's all, because of what they're doing, and also because they're holding up a lot of, you know, really good writers' jobs right now.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
Yeah. I don't see any questions, but do you see questions?
Somebody asked.
Why am I not seeing them?
Somebody asked Melissa that they wanted to know what you think of the
Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
Oh, I got it.
days.
Okay, I see that. What do you think about the potential COVID?
What do you think of the date of? That's I was looking at a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The first question is, what do you think of the potential for football this fall? That's a question for you. From what
I could tell that real quick. I can answer that. Sorry for not seeing that. I had Pat Fitzgerald. Sounds like I don't teach at all. I just bring people in, which I pretty much do. Pat Fitzgerald, the Northwestern football coach, was in my class a few weeks ago and talked about, you know, this idea of playing before empty stadiums, and his feeling is kind of like, what does that say if we are that worried about fans that we can't fill a stadium, about me and my staff of coaches that are 50 and older, and my players, you know, if they're not safe to watch, why are we safe to play? I'm so sad to say, but I just don't see, I don't see college football, you know, I don't know. I just don't envision it happening. But at the same time, boy, Northwestern certainly and other schools are really counting on that in a huge way, huge way, counting on that revenue. So I think whatever they can do, you know, they're going to try to get, you know, they're going to try to get on the field. And the knock-on effect, I'm not sure I understand that. Do you guys know knock-on effect? I mean, I've got some, yeah.
Yeah, I guess they're saying if there's no football and the revenues fall, will that affect funding for women's sports?
Yeah, it certainly could. And there could be an elimination of a lot of sports because of that. And minor sports, there's some school of thought that pro women's sports will get a bump because they're cheaper tickets. So when it comes back, you know, the economy will support the, you know, the WNBA and the momentum that women's sports have built will maybe help women's sports in a way. And this isn't good for anything, but you know, it just breaks my heart because, again, I'm close to Northwestern because I'm there. And I know that, and Iowa was my alma mater. I mean, those two women's basketball teams, Iowa and Northwestern, were really on the rise and really on a roll, and could have gone a long way in the national, you know, in the NCAA tournament. And boom, that was out. So that was really sad. And the women's softball team at Northwestern, you know, had their season knocked out, and they went a long way last year, and they were really good. So it's just awful for everybody, you know. But I don't know what you guys think about football happening. And we'll see what happens with Major League Baseball. I mean, it's a little more hands-on contact with football, obviously. And there's going to be a lot of pressure. The NFL seems to be in denial. It's like, oh yeah, it's got the preseason schedule and the schedule, and it's like they don't seem to be really worried or something.
I think none of us have ever been through anything like this before, and I think all sports are just trying to figure it out as they go along, and to try to rush to get something in is almost counterproductive to anything, because as we all know, the way this virus seems to be continuing, it's ever changing, and there have been a few ebbs and flows, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So I've kind of removed myself from the sports conversation of it and looked at it for what it is. This is so much bigger than sports. So in my mind, everybody needs to just relax and chill. Yeah. And if we all have to miss a year in certain things, then miss a year in order to get it right.
Yeah.
And we seem to be this whole culture of let's get it right. So we added video replay into things and slowed down. We did everything because we want to get it right. Now all of a sudden nobody gives a damn about getting it right, and they just want to get it. And like, no, stop. Use that same philosophy and let sports figure out what the hell is going to do for the betterment of the sport, for the betterment of the people, and just get it right.
I think that's a really good point. And having written some books about history, you realize how people don't know what they're going through at the time they're going through it, and we don't know what we're going through right now. And the worst thing you can do is overreact and move too soon, be hasty and be rash, and we just got to wait this out. It's fun to think about baseball starting up again. I like to be optimistic about it. I like to keep in my head that hey, my kid's gonna have her birthday party in 2 weeks. But I'm just choosing to go with that optimism in spite of the fact that it's probably not gonna happen.
And the thing we have to keep in mind is that sports, the beauty of sports, especially at this level that we're talking about, and even if we go down to reduced levels, it has the option of repeating itself.
Yeah.
So what we miss, we can gain because it's seasonal. All sports at this level are seasonal. Now, there are some things in life we may not ever get a chance to do over again. And that's, to me, was bigger than sports. But sports is set up in a way that everything is repeat. It's cyclical. So people really, and including us, we need to get past the point of trying to push this to happen. And I'm including league owners, commissioners, players. Hey, look, step back and realize that you can press a restart button on this because there's always a reset button on this. There are people going through things that you can't repeat because life and the way it's set up doesn't allow that.
Yeah, I think people forget that athletes can have at risk compromising situations, health conditions, diabetes and colitis, and had cancer and all kinds of stuff. Young men and also older coaches. That what happens if someone, God forbid, dies? God forbid. But I mean, it's just, is it worth the risk? It seems like Major League Baseball owners right now are really looking more at the financial side of it. And that would just be a real shame,
Yeah, I read that, speaking of Wright Thompson, he'd had that great story about Clayton Kershaw and about how this was the most important year, his most important spring training.
Yeah, right.
He's never been in better shape. He lost the World Series because he got cheated. He's getting up there in years. His arm may only have a few years left. For him to lose this season is so tragic. And I thought, no, man, we're all losing a year out of our lives. Exactly. We're all going to die someday, and our lives are 1 year shorter because of this crap. It's no different for a baseball player, but maybe that's what they say about athletes. Athletes die twice, right?
Yeah, right.
That's true.
There's a couple. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. We've got about 5 more minutes. There were a couple of questions regarding The Last Dance.
Sure. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could address those.
I could start, and then these guys could jump in. Certainly, the question of whether things were missed. I didn't think anything was missed. I enjoyed it. I thought that I would know it all when I first heard about it a couple of years ago, and I loved seeing some of the footage. You could always say there's some stuff that was, could be They could have talked to the 80s. They could have talked about the 90s, but their 70s, but that's not what it was about. I didn't think anything was particularly misrepresented. I thought it was a pretty authentic view of Michael. I was surprised at some of his shows of emotion. I thought were really touching when it was put to him that maybe he wasn't, one of the guys or, loved by his teammates. I was really sort of touched by his reaction to that. And the other, question that everybody asks is like, oh, Jerry wasn't around Krause, to defend himself. And was that fair? And he was painted the villain? I can only say just me, I didn't get along with Jerry. He didn't like me. I didn't particularly like him for many reasons. And as a beat writer, that's not unusual for GM to not love you. But I felt like he was fairly represented. That's what I felt. And so that was the big one that people think like, ooh, it was mean, I keep saying when I saw the thing on the bus, I was sad every time he was booed at championship rallies. I thought that was sad, but so don't be introduced, like he's on the bus in the documentary and Pippin's making fun of him. And it's like, oh, that's so mean. It's like, I'm yelling at the TV, get off the bus then, stop being on the bus,
Right.
Stop going in, stop hanging out with them and trying to be one of the guys then. So that's my take.
I'm much more critical than Melissa on this one. Because one, it's funny to me that they put him being dogged by Scotty on the bus, but they didn't find the film where Michael was at the driver's seat on the bus and he walked in front of the bus and, Mike's like, yo, I should step on the gas. You remember that story, right? I'm like, hey, Scotty never put a hit on him. Michael did. But to me, I'm much more critical about it because I think there were things that were missed that they had an opportunity to really at least pay attention to because they brought the subject matters up. And I won't go into deep detail, but the one thing that stands out in my mind in this is that they really painted a narrative throughout this docuseries about Krause not wanting Phil back, but they never addressed why. I know why, Melissa, you know why. So to me, the big miss was why at some point did they dive into, okay, well, why didn't Jerry want him back? Why was he so hell-bent on not having Phil back? I know the rumors, and we talked about that when it was in Utah the first time during that was kind of known, but for them not to really dive or spend any time on asking that question and at least providing an answer because it was such a strong narrative throughout that docuseries, for them to not even try to attempt to focus on that was an omission as far as I was concerned. And I'll get more minute. The fact that they didn't include the Hugh Hollins call was big, to tell that narrative of why and what Scotty had done to get the Bulls back to that stage again, that they were one foul away from getting back to the Eastern Conference Championship, which is really kind of big. And and Melissa, you'd appreciate this. I don't know why they didn't include when Scotty walked up to Karl Malone and whispered, the mailman doesn't deliver on Sunday, and made him miss those 2 free throws.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, that's why did they not put it? Because that was part of the reason they won that series. It's like, how did they not put that in there?
Because Michael was making the movie. It's Michael's movie.
Well, ESPN certainly had a lot to say. So I know that was constantly a push-pull, with ESPN wanting more 98, and pushing for that. And every time they'd go back, they wanted more 98. And I don't know, I feel like the filmmakers were as thoughtful as they could have been, hardworking as they could have been with what they had. But I see your point, certainly. And I mean, the last word was left to Michael, which was, I wish we could have won a 7th championship. And in fact, and I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but Phil wasn't coming back. So you could play it over and over.
I'll say it wasn't happening.
Right. It wasn't
happening.
It was never happening because Scotty wasn't coming back. He was not coming back. And Dennis was at the end of the line, pretty much, right? and you know, and Scott, I mean, and Phil wasn't coming back. So if Phil didn't come back, Michael wouldn't come back.
And you have to act like, to me, you have to realize these men have pride.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, you act, Phil is supposed to be a spineless individual to go back to that as if he doesn't have any other options in the NBA to coach. Right. That has to be your mindset, thinking there could be another 7. No, there can't be. After the way they treated him and what he had done and what he did, whatever, that whole scenario, there's no way they can all of a sudden, hey, man, can you come back? No, I can't come back because you're asking Phil Jackson to not have any pride at all.
Right.
And that's not going to happen.
No. No.
One of the questions wants to know what you're hinting at with Phil Jackson. I guess somebody wants to know if you'll.
Well, Melissa maybe can back this up, but from my understanding of being there and being with the team and this, that, and the other, and the whole rumors that started the year before the Last Dance was that Phil wanted to be more than a head coach. I never got specific, and that was true. I know that to be true. But I can't say that he specifically was gunning for Jerry's job, but he wanted to be more than a head coach. And from what I understand, in Jerry's mind, that meant he wanted to be general manager.
Yeah.
That's what that's what I understood the situation was and why Jerry. My problem is not with Jerry because my problem is not with Jerry Krause, because if that was actually true, then it's still Jerry Reinsdorf's decision to make that happen. Right. I don't understand if that's the truth, why the owner didn't say, okay, to keep this going, now Jerry Reinsdorf has never been one to spend a lot of money. And in order to keep Phil Jackson to give him more power, you have to pay him more money. And then you have to pay Michael more money because you already paying him $33 million on the back end of that. So what are you going to pay him that next year? Because everybody's on 1-year deal. Scottie Pippen went out and got $67 million for 4 years in Houston. What are you going to give him to keep him there? Reinsdorf one is not going to pay that money. But in order to not break this up, why don't you just say, okay, Phil, if you want more power, I'll give you general manager. Krause, I'm going to move you up to president.
Right.
Right.
It's really a simple thing the owner could have done to kept this all together. So my thing is, if the rumors that I kept hearing throughout year 5, championship 5, going into year 6 of what Krause's situation was with Phil Jackson, and not confirmed that he wanted to be general manager, but he wanted to be more than head coach, and that was the next shift up. I don't understand why the owner can't squash all that and say, look, don't worry about it. If you're worried about it, don't worry about it. I'll give him your position, I'll give you another position, and let's keep it moving.
Phil would say that he didn't want to be general manager and coach because it was a conflict of interest. He couldn't understand how people like George Karl could do it. But he clearly had his eye on that. When people think, oh, why was Phil mean to Jerry or whatever? I mean, there's so many underlying things. The reason why a lot of people didn't like Jerry felt like he made everybody, he discovered everybody, he picked Phil off the scrap heap as a hippie, and like he pulled him out of Woodstock or something. He loved telling the story. He came to his first interview with a feather in his hat, so like clearly he was high or something. It's like, okay, and so Phil was condescended to from day one, and so were most of them, and so Phil was always resentful. And Jerry resented him for allowing them to make fun of him, for allowing this culture. Phil teased him as much as anybody. You remember the story about he had his lake house in Montana, and Jerry, the sleuth, right? He was always afraid everybody would, know all his secrets and no one cared about. And so Phil had this little cabin, and not a little cabin. It became a giant house, but it was a small house. And he had a party line. You remember party lines, you guys? Where everybody in the lake could hear, your conversation. Well, Phil could have changed that at any given time, but he kept the stupid party line because it drove Jerry nuts, because every time Jerry would call, I'd be like, hi, Betty, did you get the pie recipe? Whatever. And Jerry'd be like, who is that on the phone? And Phil's like, it's Betty across the lake. But he would die laughing because, he would tease, you needle him. I mean, there was so much tension like that. I mean, it's silly, but there's so much stuff.
Yeah. This is heartbreaking because I think this could go on forever. We kind of hit the end of our time, and I really, really, really want to thank you three.
Thanks for having us, and let's do it again together in person soon.
In real life.
Buy their books, please.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, yeah. This has been great, and thank you. Thank you very much. I hope
Well,
we can
everybody.
do this
Thank
in
you, Bill.
person.
Yeah, no, thanks for putting us all together. I'm sure when all this clears up, we'll find a way to make it happen in person.
That would be great.
Absolutely.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
guys.
Take
Okay.
care.
Thank you
See
all.
ya.